the sake of all beings, wisdom, compassion, non-clinging awareness, Sadhana. I'm aware that a number of you are experiencing our engulfment in changing weather systems and pollen patterns, with coughs and sneezes and so on. And I'm experiencing it with kind of thick phlegm, kind of creeping phlegm, that goes up, and my voice is somewhat diminished today. So I'm glad the microphone's right next to my, right, so it'll hear me even if you don't. Are there any observations or questions arising before we go a bit further?
I was noticing this morning that during a meditation, there can be an inclusiveness of the visceral, physical sensations in the body. And then I noticed that I got up from the meditation and then went and had a shower and had breakfast and was being mindful. But then really noticed that there was this extremely familiar sort of default way of being, that this particular matrix of sensations in the body was it's kind of more highlighted or kind of having a stronger sense of importance in a way than the totality of my surroundings. So it kind of raised a few questions. I was wondering whether that ever goes away to a certain extent, or if it's part of
the raising of the questions ever goes away,
or the preferencing for kind of almost like a protection of the organism.
No, I'm following you now. Yep.
Yeah. But also the strong sense of identification that's tied up in that particular way of feeling that's just so familiar.
I think questioning into this is something which is just extraordinarily valuable to do. It's there's something in here which is really, really important. And if we begin to feel at home, you might say, with the idea that there has always been a dancing of knowing, and then there was perhaps this designated, agreed upon moment where the dancing of knowing began to differentiate and into an evolving bundle of processes that eventually we called Andy, right? But the knowing was, the act of movement responsiveness is always there, and it's not difficult to comprehend that primordial movement responsiveness isn't anyone's movement responsiveness. It doesn't belong to anyone. It's not an identity. It's like, because after all, if we go back far enough, Andy's gone, long gone, I mean, what I was trying to hint at the other day, and I'm not sure if I was clear enough, when I talked about Neanderthal sex, was a sense that, I mean, the sperm and the egg are at a molecular level, right? Awesomely complex matrices of dancing process. They're not just a sperm and an egg, two things, right? Both of them are just like extraordinarily alive. Both of them are autopoiesis, and both of them are responding to shifts and changes in the environment, right? And that we've just decided to start the conversation there. We could start it further back, right? And the thing is that gave rise to a Neanderthal pickaninny, right? Who then fell head over heels with another Neanderthal pickaninny, right? And there was another sperm swimming towards an egg, right? And actually the living process doesn't, like the end of this life and the beginning of the next life, there's no end or beginning. The living process just goes on. And this process, as we increasingly be able to look at processes being movements of complex systems of movement of responsivenesses, right, kind of knowings, right, has been going on. And you could, in theory, maybe we could imagine tracing your particular lineage going back, right, to Neanderthals, back to pre-Neanderthals, back to pre-mammalian, right? And we see this kind of, and then we go forward. We turn around and go forward, and we say, this is Andy becoming. This is the proto-consciousness of Andy before it became Andy. But we wouldn't normally speak that way, right? We would say, well, it's kind of no one knowing. And then all of a sudden we get to this human place, and I'm knowing, this is my knowing, this is the only knowing, right? And so we arrive at being a human, and in the womb there's kicking, but I find it difficult to imagine the baby, while they're kicking, going, I'm now kicking. Hey, can you feel me? That's not really a realistic imagination that I work with. Maybe that's what's going on, and it's a limitation of my imagination, but it's not the way I work. And I see that, we have all these movements, and these movements themselves are responsivenesses. And so a responsiveness to another responsiveness is a kind of perception. So now we've got perception with no one perceiving, right? But the organism is transforming through the types of perceptions, right? And the types of, so if you have a fetal alcohol syndrome womb, there's different kinds of perceptions, different kinds of responses than if you're in a more benign, healthy environment womb, right? I'm making a crude example to try but in a sense, every thought, every flicker of movement of change in mother is a change in the environment of growing dynamic living system. Don't even want to call it an organism, right? Which is doing this utterly in response to that, and that is doing in utter response to this, plus its relationship with outside of itself. Right? So mother is shifting and changing in response to the people she meets and the places where she goes, and the weather systems and so on, but she's also responding to the changes inside her body as the system. It's like living systems within living systems. And when we look at it this way, it seems quite, for the purpose of convenience of discourse and speaking, that we say this is mother and that's fetus, and then we can kind of talk about something. Because if we didn't do that, there's no place where one ends off and the other begins. It's a flowing movement. Right? And in a way, as this becomes more complex, we begin to, there's movement, And then there's gradually a sense, with as I said the other day, with the complexity of the neural system, a sense of the organism, moving. And we know that because when you can see it, you can't ask the baby because the baby can't talk. But when the baby's in the crawling stage, all of the baby crawls across the floor, not just the front half or the back half, right? It's a coordination of arms and leg and head, and you can also see it seems to be in extraordinary harmony with the emotions of the baby. They're kind of like interested and they're backing off, right? We can kind of surmise. We don't know what their experience is, but I think it's not unreasonable that we can make useful guesses based on the fact that we operate in the same way, right? And then meanwhile, you're in an environment. We humans, like chimpanzees are not. Chimpanzees at this stage, we could say it's all the same. Everything's exactly the same. But one major difference is that chimpanzees don't find themselves in a world of spoken language such that we use. That's missing. That doesn't exist for them. They have language, right? There are all kinds of communications and signing to each other and so on, but this sense of having a felt sense of breath and lungs and muscle and vocal cord and so on going in a particular expulsion of air, right, that is accompanied by eardrum vibrating in a certain way and brain going in a certain way such that we think we hear the word and then another person can pick it up and we say the word means this, and we start to live in a world in which the thing that we're focusing on means something else. Okay? And this is, if you think that it took don't know for sure, could have been vast spacefaring civilizations, I suppose, living on planet Earth. They're completely eradicated by tectonics and ecological process and so on, and risen and falling a number of times. But we don't really know. And so as far as our story goes, we're the first ones in 4 billion years. So from the point of view of nature, imagine nature giving rise to this amazing kind of game called conjuring up my whole physiology so that it functions in a way that expels air compressions, right? Such that the ear hears it, and we can, kind of do this in relationship with this, that, and the other, and we can speak. And you could imagine nature going, whoa, that was pretty good, eh? Like invented this. And this is not so much an explanation, but it's a kind of a trying to justify our blindness, right? It's a kind of, it's understandable that maybe consciousness would be enamored with this new trick, right? With this new kind of device or game that we've got, and we're kind of have become hypnotized. If you think about it, the words are always a description of something else. In other words, an explanation, right? An explanation of what something else is, right? And we've gradually started to forget, well, we never really knew. We haven't quite woken up to the fact, because it just happens, right? But what we explain is what we observe. But what we observe is not, from a certain point of view, what we are. And we lose touch with the kind of seamless kinesthetic connectedness with everything. And we start to live lives of, I'm here, and I'm here, and I'm here, and I'm here. And then it gets more complex with social conditioning. And whether you might come out, your you were a Tibetan Tulku Rinpoche in your last life, right? And you were a pretty accomplished Lama, right? Except for one little quirk. And so you died and you went into the bardo and you turned accidentally left instead of right, right? Instead of being born into some yak herding woman who was going to bring you up and then you'd be recognized as the Dalai Lama, right? You were born to a couple in Australia, you know, so you're, what are you doing here, you know? And so instead of coming out and everyone is going, honor to the universe, honor to the totality of the universe, they're going, everyone's a little bit uncomfortable, and they say, is it a girl or a boy? And so then they say, it's a boy. Then suddenly there's relaxation, right? Because, isn't he nice? Or it's a girl. Isn't she beautiful, right? And so immediately we start getting, we don't know anything about it. We're just sitting there. We didn't choose this, right? But we start getting gender pushed on us. Gender isn't that, right? Gender is attitudes, right? And so we get gender put, and then gradually there's a sound that you hear again and again and again, you know, Andy. But gradually you start to recognize that if you go like this, then there's more attention coming here. So you entrain yourself to identify this dancing of kinesthetic sensation. You're not doing this intellectually. You're doing this kind of neurologically. There's an association with the neuronal dancings that are going along with sound and memory, right? And the neuronal dancings that are going along with tension and digestive process and posture and so on. And you begin to associate that this dancing configuration, this kind of feeling, this kinesthetic feeling, is an Andy. Right? Then you start to find out that if you are an Andy that is a nice Andy, then that's leads to certain kinds of responsive engagements with the world. And if you become an Andy that's called a bad Andy, that leads to other responsivenesses in the world. And so this is the beginning of identity. You know, because you like to, in a sense, identify with the good Andy, because that is more functional for you, and then you don't want to be the bad Andy. So then, if there's any hint of bad Andy is something that exists in other people's minds. Bad Andy in your experience is the global integrative functioning that you are experiencing when somebody else relates to you as a bad Andy. Right? And that inner feeling is the guts of it. And so you start to have an aversion to that kind of feeling. And that's also a way of perceiving. And so, you know, in a sense, with our society, which is like so extraordinarily invested in facade and persona, and, you know, and you invent all these kinds of personalities on the internet now, so you can have lots and change them and so on, and people are discovering you can get into trouble doing that, right? When they don't kind of, when two areas, which were fine if they were kept apart, suddenly get confused, right? And so gradually what happens is that we're living in a culture which is, it's almost as if, you know, this extraordinary rhythmic play of you know, maybe in Maxine Sheets Johnson speaks about kind of 4 fundamental qualities maybe of this kind of kinesthetic living awareness, beingness, and one of the qualities is force, and one of the qualities is effort, and one of the qualities is space, and one of the qualities is time. Right? And in a sense, like in every moment, you can see like the movements that you are a response to a force. In other words, that's when you feel it's happening to me. Right? And then there's when the movements that you are kind of willfully, kind of volitionally initiated, and this is an effort for you to do. Right? And you're thinking you're just doing things like when you're sitting down. Right? Just what we'll do now is we'll just pause and we'll do an experiment. And I just want you to stand up and see if you can have a feeling through your whole body of a richer play of movement responsiveness that's involved in getting you upright. Right? And then sit down, right, and do the same, the same kind of watching. And years ago, I used to talk about the body of experience, right, and feeling the shifts and tracking the shifts and changes in the body of experience. It was exactly the same thing. I just didn't have the detail of understanding to be able to flesh it out into, like more specific equatings to different physiological functionings. Right? So let's just stand up and sit down a few times. And I want you to particularly be open to noticing, can I identify in this aspects of kinesthesia which could be called different experiences of force. There's different kinds of force. There's ballistic force, there's demanding force, there's gentle force, right? There's sensitive force. There's also effort, right? There's kind of hard, grit your teeth effort. There's jerky effort. There's smooth, harmonized effort, right? There's flowing effort, right? And then spaciousness, like our sense of spaciousness is very much tied up with, like, tense yourself up right now. And then release. And then tense. And then release. In the tensing, spaciousness is shrinking. In the releasing, spaciousness is expanding. Right? We're talking about the actual quality of the felt sense. Right? Timing. If I become very still and quiet, I begin to realize that I am just filled with rhythms. Repetitive rhythms. I can feel my heartbeat, my breath rhythming. All of these are kind of like footprints of timings, right? And my sense of like being in a rush or lots of time. And we find the time is shaping the space is shaping the effort space shaping the force, which is shaping the time, which is shaping the, right? And this whole thing. And all we're doing is standing up and sitting down. And most of the time people don't notice any of this. And yet this is where our livingness is taking place. Go a little bit faster so that it's a little bit more natural. And then notice how you could be controlling yourself to try and watch, but then you're outside it. Just let go into the standing and sitting. And feel how the texture of the seat exerts a force on the kinesthetic body, which then is responded to by the muscles. And you're making an effort to stand up, which is then responded to by the force of the air pressure or the gravity pushing on you. Everything's shaping everything else. And as you're doing this, open your ears and appreciate the sound of lawnmower. And turn to the right and look, and then come back. And in the flow of doing this, there also thoughts will come, right? And the thoughts will be often associated with the movement. Like you can just you know, there's a difference between you know, if I say turn your head to the right, and then what do you see? And then you say, oh, I see a such and such, right? And so you know, and so, or I say, what's your experience? And you say, my experience is that I turned to the right and saw such and such. But actually, that's your description in an attempt to communicate to something to me of something which was beyond words, a kind of rich, flowing engagement, which is always in the present. We say smiling, breathing, present. Like that's just like I'm right in the midst. You know, in the ancient Satipatthana text, they sometimes said in the seeing, there's just the seeing. In the perception, in the perceiving, there's just the perceiving. And I always used to think it meant like, you know, you're seeing and everything else goes blank. You don't hear anything. You don't, there's just seeing. And I really struggled with that. I couldn't find that in my experience. But what if they're saying in the act of seeing, there's actually, the act of seeing is just the act of seeing. The description of the act of seeing is not the act of seeing. Right? And the beginning steps of liberation, because we are living in a culture which is, by and large, it's almost like you got this big ocean of activity, and then you got this running commentary of description, which is the form of relationship that we have with each other, humans, because we don't talk too much to trees. They're kind of incoherent English-wise, and so we talk to humans, right? And gradually, the whole of the rest of the world disappears in importance. And it's almost like, you know, one of these cartoon characters that comes running, and then there's the end of the cliff, and they're out in space, and their legs are still going like crazy, right? But they haven't realized yet that there's no ground there. And then when they look around, oh my God, there's no ground, boom, down they go. It's like, damn. Right? Until you went, oh my God, there's no ground, you happily paddled in space. Right? You know, right? It was there. It was like but we have this, in a sense, we're living in, this is the suffering of samsara, the blindness of samsara. We've, in a sense, conned ourselves into believing that the world we describe and argue about what's really there and so on, which is just the realm of description and explanation, is the actual world that we are. And it isn't. Most of the world of what we are is consciousness unfolding in a kind of non-human language fashion. And that the human language fashion is just a beautiful, wonderful adornment on the surface of 4 billion years of evolution. Not to get rid of it, but to be able to use it from this place of, what does it mean when I feel centered? That I'm actually centered in the midst of the living that I am. And you know, as a student of Dharma, as a student of truth, in the early stages and continuing on forever, but very much in the early stages, right? The sign of our being a student of Dharma is that we start becoming very interested in encouraging a richer contact with the roots of beingness that we are. Right? And we do that by just standing up and sitting down. We do that by stretching a limb and coming back. This is deep meditation with, like smiling, breathing, present. Right? That's just like, it's always right here. This functioning is all, you can't pause in this. That's the trouble. That's what makes it really difficult. Like you think you almost got it. Well, I'll just stop for a moment and look back and see what went on there. And then we recognize, but this is a new going on, not what went on. And you can't stop the action so that you can have a consideration. Right? It just keeps rolling on. And this looks like, oh yeah, it's so difficult. Don't worry, it's been going on for 4 billion years. The present has never stopped. Right? Smiling, breathing, present, appreciating. Right? And this is where we can just allow a bit of that. That's where description comes in. That's where the explanation comes in. That's where the words are coming in a sense. It's like because we're saying, and then my heart went like this, and my digestion's going like this, and there's this feeling, and that's what Longchenpa meant. Or, maybe Damasio is really getting on about this, right? And without losing contact with that beating moment, right? And so I talk about translucentizing our experience, right? So that you can appreciate these different levels without having to, like, I get so enamored with the description observation level that I lose touch with the level which is in a sense manifesting me. Right? And so I'm beginning to appreciate more and more complexity and dancings of this. And there's great value in that appreciation because it also empowers us to interact with others, other unknowable unfoldings of billions of years of evolution, right, in ways that perhaps more mutually supportive of our unfolding. This is Mahayana. This is the heart of Mahayana. And so, in a way, we could look at the Bodhisattva vow that we looked at yesterday, is kind of speaking about, what this is something I can do. I can train myself to meet all beings with kindness and interest. I can, right, and so on. Right? And then we come today to the meditation on the 4 immeasurables. And this is where we've become, in a sense, there's a strength in this sense of like a competency in I can do this. And then there's an increasing dawning realization that we can do this. Right? That's the Brahma Vihara. Right? All right? Yeah. Right? So this is, in a sense, it's now shifted a little bit from this kind of concern for me. It's a glorious concern for me. May I meet all beings with kindness and interest. It's like we're getting to the point now we can kind of bring together that sense of identity, but with a more life-giving possibility. May I touch difficulties with patience and love, right? May I explore the dharmas deeply and thoroughly, right? The dharmas are the truths. What I've been talking about, that's the dharmas. That's what we're exploring, right? That's why, in a sense, the Theravadan tradition said it all right from the very beginning, right? It's almost like the Vajrayana tradition, such as you see in Tibet, came along a lot later, and it was almost like people were just too sophisticated to be able to get the straightforward teaching. In the seeing, there's just the seeing. Just mindfulness. Attend to what you're doing. Right? And so you had a culture that was really caught up in all kinds of social beliefs and structures and hierarchies. Right? And so they had to kind of weasel in these very deep teachings in the guise of deities and rituals and all kinds of stuff. And then gradually you come to the Mahamudra and the Dzogchen, and you've actually, it's no different than the simplicity of presence that's there in the great Theravadan sages, right? And the great Mahamudra and Dzogchen sages. It's the same, right? So you know, however incomparable or however immeasurable the dharmas are, they're immeasurable, right? You could say a dharma is almost like different angles of understanding the integrated wholeness in the act of dancing. Right? Integrative understandings, different angles of integrative. There's the kind of conceptual understanding of it, the intellectual understanding of it, the emotional understanding of it, the physical sensation understanding of it, the kind of metabolic understanding of it, right? Every time you meet with the universe, your metabolism changes, the rhythms of big functionings change, you know, heartbeat, breathing rate, that kind of stuff, right? Every time you meet with something, your skeletal muscular system is just subtly shifting and orienting. Like if I want to look at you, the only way I can look at you is from, all I want to do is to look, right, and see Kyle, right? But in order to do that, I have to involve my skeletal muscular system, right? And my ocular muscles around my eyes and pupil focusings and all kinds of changes in chemistry in the brain, right? Along with remembered kinesthetic melodies, right? Kinesthetic memories, right? I kind of remembered these things of like, when this feeling is here, that's called seeing a Kyle. That's why I recognize you. Right? I see you, and how do I remember that you're Anne? You know, that I've known you before. Why don't I act like some of these people that Damasio describes in his case histories, where they've had a stroke or some catastrophic accident, and all of a sudden they're living in this extraordinary present, right? And they've got no ability to form memories. And so you know, he described one chap, and he was perfectly functional, you know, he's a very friendly person, and Damasio would come in, and the patient would say, "Oh, hello, who are you? What's your name?" And so Damasio would introduce himself, and then as part of his experiment, and as well, he's being a neurologist, taking advantage to kind of both help the person, but use that situation to learn more, right? Damasio would make some excuse and get up and go out of the room. And he would go out for 1 second and come back in. And the conversation would continue. And then he'd go out for 2 seconds and come back in, and the conversation would continue. And then eventually a certain time would come up. He'd go out for that length of time. He'd come back in, and the person would say, "Oh, hello, it's so nice to meet you. Who are you?" Right? Because there's no memory. What do we mean by memory? We mean that somehow this memory is a kind of a capacity to access pre-formed integrated circuits of functioning, right, in our being, so that we have this kind of feeling and word and idea and texture that goes when I see this person, which is different than this person, different than this person, right? And so I can go, my kinesthetic memory says, oh, this is Kyle, right? So not only do I need my muscles to look at Kyle, I have to have my memories of the Kyle I'm expected, and then I get this little jiggle of seeing a Kyle that's very close to the feelings, but not exactly the same. And there's a little dilemma as to whether I accept this as the real Kyle, or whether it's a mistake on my part, or whether or not you're the same person who's changed, or what. And we work out some kind of working compromise. in our own being, right? And the grounds of what we call clear perception or something like that is simply that the compromise that we've come to is good enough. But if it isn't, it doesn't work. But there's not some person who's in my memory that I'm accessing, like there's the N and there's a thing, and I'm going, does this thing correspond with the N that I know? And I go, oh yes it does, and then that's N. That's not the way it works. There's no gap. It's like my looking in this way is my Anning. my perceiving and what I'm perceiving are not separate. They're separate for the observer, but not for the experiencer. Right? So, however, there are immeasurable ways of looking at things, dharmas, right? And there's a sense of really having an interest to explore this deeply and thoroughly, to like really want to understand what's going on. Like, wow, what's going on, right? And instead of trying to understand what's going on by going to university and asking experts to share with me their great wisdom of what's going on, it occurs to me that the what's going on is in the ongoingness of my whatting, of my living, of my questioning. And so, I can do that at university, or I could do that not at university. It's not where you learn and unfold as a mature human being. Humans are great. I mean, we've demonstrated being able to do it well in a vast array of situations and circumstances. And so when we come to the four immeasurables, right, in a sense we're extending this. It's like, may all beings have happiness, and I'm going to change the text. So if you can pencil this in if you like, because I'm going to change this. May all beings have happiness and live the causes of happiness. Right? Instead of may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. Because this is kind of can be misleading in a sense, like as if somehow to have the causes, oh, I don't have the causes, but actually the cause of happiness is the way of living that you are. When you live in a certain way, that's happiness. When you live in another way, that's not happiness. There's no other happiness, right? So may all beings be happy and have the causes of happiness. And the word happiness that's being translated is some form or version, depending on the chant you're doing, of sukha, or sukhi atanam, sukha, right? And the word su is associated with good, in the sense of like well-functioning, well-integrated, healthy, natural, flowing rightness about it, right? Su. And ka is associated with space. Namjal used to like to say, that he would refer to the sound of the crow. It's a very Northern Hemisphere Canadian kind of experience, right? That meant lots to us living at the Dharma Center, right? So you're out in the stark winter and the snow on the ground and everything's cold and still, and then and it's like the sound would kind of reverberate out. It was a big space sound, right? And maybe it was like this for people in India as well. That ka was like space. So we're talking about like a good space, and we start seeing that this is a quality of the kinesthetic experience, space, right? Like what is the functioning of cells and organs and organ systems and neuronal groupings and body and self and other, such that we call this happiness. Right? May all beings be happy and live the causes of happiness, right? Just as you're in the first Bodhisattva vow, however innumerable beings are, I vow to meet them with kindness and interest. Right? I mean, this is like, meeting beings with kindness and interest makes me happy. Me happy. Now we're extending it. May all beings be happy. May all beings live with kindness and interest. Okay? And so we're working with this. Can you begin to explore? Can you find within yourself the interest to explore that kind of lived sense that's present, that is the functioning that an observer calls happiness, sukha, right? A kind of an inviting space, a life-giving space, a good functioning at every level, metabolic, like my physiology, my physical body is functioning well, my emotional kind of relationships, if you like, right, are working well, right? That feels good.
My old mates describe sukha as mental happiness, but that makes it sound quite limited, doesn't it?
Well, it is mental happiness because the feeling of happiness is not this joint or that organ, so it's not physical. It's an integrated summation of the whole physical, and the way we're speaking right now, although I am aware that I'm drawing my attention, it can sound like we're drawing our attention to the body, right? I'm trying to say again and again and again that the act of responsiveness is a knowing. It's mental. But mental is embodied. Okay? And you see, part of our explanations are dependent on who we're talking to. When we're talking to beings who have a really fixed investment in body and mind, then, you know, and you're trying to explain things rather than challenge the very roots of their living, right? You kind of agree to use these terms, but it's full of possible misleadingness. It's a mental happiness. But in the light that we're talking about now, what do we mean by mental? Might as well just get rid of mental and get rid of body. Right? There's a kind of relational, functional moving. That's why it's so kind of ephemeral and hard to pin down. Right? That's why we say it's emptiness. You know, it's this ungraspable, shunyata. May all beings be apart from sorrow and the causes of sorrow, right? May all beings be apart from dukkha, a kind of clumsy, dysfunctional, unintegrated space of functioning, right? Where their chemistry is at odds with their hopes, where their muscular tensions are at odds with their heart functioning, you know, where their blood pressure is at odds with their, you know, whatever levels, right? This is dukkha, right? Dukkha is a difficult, it's a tight space. It's a kind of contracted space. It's a kind of a not nice space. It's a struggling space. It's a drowning space. It's a clunky, rough, abrasive space. It's not good enough just to say suffering. Because that's what suffering is. All those spaces and combinations all weaving through, like how you describe the describer, the explainer, the observer. Yeah, I could say this space and this space and this space. But in the dukkha, you know, in the midst of dukkha, and somebody says, oh, you know, that's just a mental thing. And you go, yeah, thanks. Right? You know, Or it's sort of like you have some terrible illness and everything, and it's coming on, and then they say, "Oh, it's okay. It's genetic. It's not your fault." So you go, "Oh, great. I feel a lot better." It's a bit like Jacqueline Dupre, you know, who sort of struggled for years before she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and a lot of her society around her, unfortunately, treated her as if this was all forms of a neuroses. And she spent years in psychotherapy and everything trying to sort herself out. And, you know, because what she would get there, can you imagine, this is like a nightmare come true, you know. So she's playing in Carnegie Hall, probably costs $100,000 to sort of for one performance, you know what I mean? Like to fill the hall and run it and pay all the technicians and so on. And they've all come to hear her play a solo piece. You know, she's a great cellist. And she sits down on the stage, and the fingers in her left hand go numb, and she can't feel the strings. And she plays just this really, she just soldiers on and played a really second-rate performance. And she was very disturbed, and she began to think, well, this is kind of psychosomatic, and I'm somehow, you know, trying to defeat I can't accept my success, and I have to defeat this. And she went to tons of therapy and had lots of counseling and everything. And finally, after many, many years, some doctor said, "You have multiple sclerosis." And in her autobiography, she said at that moment she actually felt incredibly happy because it wasn't her fault. But that passed quickly, and then she had to settle into having not happy. I've got multiple sclerosis. Right? But it is sort of like the struggle that we work with. This is the dukkha, right? This is the sorrow of our life. That's what they mean by sorrow, right? All beings be apart from sorrow, right? So can you, when you do feel this presence of sorrow, and sometimes it's worth artificially conjuring it up if you don't have enough of it to be able to understand it, right? And then to really look at it through the eyes of however immeasurable the dharmas are. I vow to explore them deeply and thoroughly, and begin to really deeply, thoroughly, sensitively, appreciatively, smiling, breathing, present, enter into this integrated weaving of body, speech, and mind, which an observer calls sorrow, calls dukkha, calls suffering, right? And begin to see, begin to understand, right? Because you see, the cause of suffering is functioning that way. And the cessation of the cause of suffering is to function in a different way. This is truly liberating to see this, because we really actually can begin to participate in our functioning far more effectively. I'm saying that because I didn't say we then can truly begin to control our functioning. You can never control your functioning, because arguably the broad majority of functionings that make us up aren't me. You know, they're out of my hands. They're forces. They're not efforts. Okay? That's part of this, right? This is kind of the push and pull, the billiard table balls, you know, like bang, boom, right? The weather changes, something shifts, and we all get kind of coughs and colds or what have you, right? Okay? And then, meanwhile, you're functioning. Right? So this second one, it's not just sitting here a little pious witch, it's an invitation to deep investigation on behalf of all of us. Because now if I begin to understand that the sorrow that the person experiences is in the functioning that they are, and I would actually like to help them, the way I go about helping them would be different than if I believe that the sorrow that they're experiencing is these bad guys who have got it in for them. It's not to say there aren't bad guys that got it in for them, but the experience of the sorrow, the experience of the sukha, of the happiness, right? What is that? The experience of making your lunch, of going to the toilet. Like, don't forget about religious stuff and pujas and all this kind of stuff, right? And really find this happening as you pick your nose and you scratch and you get dressed and you sit down and you lie down, and right? There's like, it doesn't matter what you're doing, boredom and so on, there's a whole configuration that's boredom, a whole configuration that's this, you know, it never stops, right? And the Bodhisattva is sometimes described as a kind of spiritual hero, in the sense that there's a certain kind of heroic quality in being dedicated to just again and again and again throw yourself into this unknown age of adventuring, and so you constantly end up on your butt. You know, you kind of fall over. You're constantly losing the plot because, well, it's like me and the universe. So, but gradually, right, we begin to learn the subtle teaching of the field of knowing praxis, right? That's just, I mean, why don't we just say the subtle teaching of living, right? The living that I am is teaching me about the living that I am, that we are. Right? May all beings be filled with joy when sensing the wholesome activity of others. Right? And recognizing, like what is the kinesthetic matrix of functioning, if you like, the felt sense. It's constantly being related to kinesthetic memory, and the memories are contributing to a refinement and adjustment in the direction of the kinetics. And the kinetics are constantly being laid down as memory, right, which are adjusting the current kinetic. Like, you know, as you reach out to open the fridge, right, there is a certain degree of remembering of this act of reaching out for the fridge, which is then being drawn on for future reaching out for the fridges and affecting the way you make the next thing. So that, in a sense, our past is shaping our present, but our present is shaping the way we understand our past. Whew. And how is it that I can feel joy when I see the good functioning of another being? And what is the kind of the functioning of my being with a sense of jealousy, or a sense of envy, or a sense of seeing their success and then immediately feeling my lack of success? Right? What the possibility of, how can we possibly expect to encourage a healthy universe if whenever we see anybody else having success, it makes us feel crappy? It's absolutely impossible to bring forth a healthy universe unless we can start to encourage and nurture a disposition in our being to actually feel happy about other beings' happiness. May all beings be graced with the serenity of unshakable mindfulness and loving presence. What is the kinesthetic, the body functioning of unshakable mindfulness and loving presence? What is shakable mindfulness and loving presence? What is shakable mindfulness and not loving presence? What is unshakable mindfulness and loving non-presence? Right? They're all different, right? Like, Mahayana really begins when I've often made a joke, you know, that all the religious traditions pray like this because they're ready to dive in, you know. We're kind of, this is the mudra of, we're about to dive in, right? So we go like this, And then most people never, I think I'll go, I'm not going to jump. But the whole thing is like, hey, you take a deep breath, then you go, right? But in a sense, it's diving in. It's like we're diving into the fullness of the living that we are, and the fullness that the living that we are as human beings is interested in understanding and appreciating the fullness of the living that we are in the act of appreciating and understanding the fullness of the living that we are, right? And so together we bring forth a universe, which seems to be quite different from a whole lot of people who are protecting their own turf and competing and worried about what other people think. And we're trying to, how are we going to deal with climate change and kind of make a sustainable society and everything? Well, actually, in that mind state, you're not. Period. Right? The only long-term sustainability is truth. And no one needs to work too hard on it because it's sort of what we are. Huh? Any questions or thoughts? I think we've kind of looked at what I'd like to look at this morning.
I was
Yeah.
reflecting about this sukha and dukkha, and that there is a relationship going on between these two, and it's almost like without dukkha there is no sukha, something like this, because it's sometimes I think that the suffering and this contracted state, struggles and difficulties is like what makes us move and relate and.
Well, I think part of the confusion in this can come is like muddling up again what Maturana talked about, the kind of generative process, what I would think of as like the factual what's happening. That's there's this word that most people aren't used to, but it's kind of, we could say, the factual happening that instantiates this moment. It's like making instant, it is this moment, right? And then there's the explanation, the description, right? And in the description, we need the dukkha for the sukha. We need the sukha. The sukha is only sukha compared to the dukkha in the description, right? But I think it's a useful question to ask if that holds true with the generative process, right? The totality process that is generating the ongoing present flowing of experience. You know, the sadhana began by arranging yourself in a comfortable posture, right? And thinking of comfort as being a kind of a way of integrative functioning, right? That an observer would call strengthening. A way of integrative functioning that an observer would call strengthening, right? Now I just want to point out to you, like, the difficulties we're struggling with, right? We live in a culture right now where people, in the name of New Agey teaching, and Buddhists have borrowed it, and, therapy and so on, they say, oh, it's good to get out of your comfort zone. Mm-hmm. And in the light that I'm speaking about it, that's a confusion. There's a confusion here, right? Because there is the integrative functioning of the generative process. And it's always integrative. It just depends on what it's generating. You know, it takes an integrative process to generate an experience that an observer would call totally disconnected and painful. Right? But actually, at the level of the functioning, it's perfectly in harmony. Everything's working well. Right? In truth, you know, nothing could go wrong, as it says in the Heart Sutra. Right? But at the level of the description, right, we say, oh, well, of course, you know, it's like, it's not, that's bad, or this is good, and so on. Right? So I'm wondering, in a sense, like Sukha is referring to this, it's first of all referring to this generative process, right? It's a descriptive word, it's an observer's word, it's a, you know, an attempt to describe, you know, it's like this, you're looking at this, imagine you go in, it's like a physics lab, it's a cloud chamber or something, and you got all this stuff whirling around, you're looking at tracks, everything appearing, disappearing. In fact, you can't even see it because they got fantastic cameras and it's all analyzed by computers because it's too much going on for the human eye, right? And you look into it and you go, oh, that's Sukha. And then, you know, change the experiment, you look into that, oh, that's Dukkha, right? It's a summation of the whole thing, right? But in both of them, you had totally integrative functioning, right? And so we could say, well, you know, like for the, your sense of Sukha and Dukkha is, it's true, it's relative. You know, like a person feels good when they become the tyrant's favorite courtier, right? So that the, you know, like you're hanging out with this absolutely vile being who's historically there, but this vile being treats you as like my lieutenant and so on, and you can run around and do all these things and you're feeling really good. And when this vile being rejects you, you feel miserable and full of dukkha, right? So here in a strange way, you know, you've got, you know, or a sadomasochistic relationship, you know, where the person is like constantly going and looking to be beaten or abused or kind of trod upon, it's because it makes them feel good, right? And so in our process of exploring what is suffering and the causes of suffering and so on, in the process of looking into the causes of suffering, we gradually recognize, if we really look, doesn't matter what level we look at, we'll see that suffering is arising out of a functioning process which goes beyond what we had originally considered. Then you realize that the tyrant had problems, unresolved problems with their mum or dad. Right? And poor old Donnie, right, is still struggling under the shadow of his dad. Right? And so now my understanding of it, instead of him being this, now he's the kind of the tyrant becomes the victim, right? And so we've expanded it, right? So now we start to look into, we have a Sukha and Dukkha within that frame, and we expand that. If we keep on doing this, eventually it will expand to take into account the metabolic health of forests and soil biota and the cycling of the atmosphere and the geosphere and so on. Because if we just keep on exploring this, eventually, because of the interbeingness there is, it will lead to everything else. And so we gradually refine our criterion of what Sukha consists of. Because, you know, at the beginning, Sukha is like, basically, I'm going to meet beings with kindness and interest because, basically, makes me feel better. Right? in the end. Because if I meet you with sort of suspicion and nastiness and so on, it bounces back on me, and I don't like that. So I don't really care about you, but I'm going to meet you with kindness and interest, because in the end it's better for me. You could actually see the Bodhisattva vow as a kind of a step. That's why it comes before, or that's why I've put it before the Brahma Vihara. 'Cause, I mean, we could rearrange it, but it's just a way of thinking, right? That usually, first of all, we're motivated from our own needs, but then gradually, as that these four are very parallel. It looks very much like the first Bodhisattva vow is something to do with metta, and the second one seems to be something to do with compassion, karuna or upaya, and the third one seems to be something to do with sympathetic joy, exploring the dharmas of other is sympathetic joy, right? And equanimity, right, is kind of surrendering into interbeing, right? They're kind of parallel, right? Except the second one in the Brahma, just the way I've chosen to put it and the way I'm describing it, it's like emphasizing, may I be this, and then may all beings be this, right? And I'm beginning to experience the sukha and the dukkha, and so on, in a way that includes all beings, as opposed to at the beginning, it was my dukkha, it's like there's a Mahayana going on. There's an expansion of understanding, and I often sort of think to myself, Tarchin, you're a really slow learner. I feel like I've been saying this for a long time, but I'm beginning to understand this. I really am. I'm beginning to get this. 50 years, I'm beginning to get it. It just kind of keeps slipping away. I haven't, quite got it, right? But it's like, and maybe it's because I'm a slow learner. I have this kind of theory to make myself feel better in my inferior slow learningship, right? Is that, I get the sense that maybe this is a big project for any of us. And that this isn't something you just do and do and do, and then we turn the page and get on to the next section. It might be a life of, we started off a zillion years ago, someone gave us the Brahma Vihara to meditate on. And then 40 years later, you pick up the Brahma Vihara and you go, oh my God, what was I thinking then? Because it's just so much more. Right? And so I think it's an ongoingness, right? I suppose in the verbal realm where we're obsessed with language, we're going to have to come up with mega Mahayana, because we always want to surpass it, so eventually Mahayana won't be enough, because, well, I've achieved Mahayana, now I want Mahayana, right? But maybe this expansiveness, this Mahagata, this is the word we use in Buddhism. It's like moving towards an increasingly magnanimous, enlarging space of wisdom, compassion, beingness, lovingness, livingness, right, is never ending. And so my aspiration is to live until I die. And to me that feels like a really profound aspiration, which is meaningful to me, to live, right? Because this is what we're talking about, is the living. It's like the growing and the deepening and the broadening. So I think that sometimes, like the sense, well, we need the good in order to have the bad. It's a bit like the Buddha's middle way. And so the Buddha taught the middle way. Okay, I get it. We're supposed to walk the middle way. So I've got too much bliss, right? I shouldn't have so much bliss and happiness, because the Buddha said the middle way. So I really do have to have a little bit, get out of my comfort zone, right? Too much feeling strong in good functioning. I've got to have a bit weak, ineffectual, bad metabolism, because the Buddha said you can't have just good metabolism. You've got to have bad metabolism too. But I somehow don't I just don't really have a sense that's what he meant by the middle way, some kind of hypothetical place between the extremes of hyper goodness and hyper badness. Okay? I wonder if we could have a maybe the middle way is kind of balancing between our humanity as generative process and our humanity as explainer, sharer, investigator, observer. Is that sufficient for this morning? No?
I just make a comment that it's not really a question, because the whole discourse this morning has illuminated an experience I had last night, in waking up, of recognizing the kinesthetic feeling of, a certain feeling of the body. And I've spoken to you before about that feeling of being outside the body. Well, that sort of had what am I saying? That is a kind of kinesthetic memory, and it's for whatever reasons, and for whatever reasons, it wasn't inviting. It's a memory of a feeling that is kind of associated with bad janet, so to speak. And just the ability last night to sort of just recognize that brought an incredible sense of joy, that there was this feeling. Yeah, and just to say that your whole class has illuminated that.
Good.
Could I just play off the this idea of like a new age kind of moving outside your comfort zone?
Yes.
Or kind of exploring your fears and insecurities, or what Carl Jung would say your shadow self,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
That
it's not really the as you were saying, the Dharma teaching this all the different domains of skills that allow us to function, participate in our function. But is there still value to maybe exploring these things, like you have anxiety or something, you could sit down and kind of, you just said moving towards interbeingness will lead to everything, but is there value in just maybe going out and putting yourself in situations where you have to move into your fear and then realize and see that the fear is not as bad as it was, and it's just a different, it is more of a new age kind of way of thinking about growth in general, and I just wonder if that's valuable as far as your whole growth in general. Yeah,
the two things. One, I was just making a play on the word comfort, right? In a sense, meeting with what Jung called the shadow, or exploring your fears and the repercussions of your fears is the path of awakening. It's not there's a place for it. Is the path of awakening.
Right.
If that's your path of awakening is the life you're living. If you're living that, you've got to explore it. It'd be absurd. How could it not be, right? But I don't think that the aspiration to be out of a way of functioning that gives you strength as being a way of liberation is meaningful. Because liberation is good functioning strength. It's just like, like somehow I'm going to learn to love by practicing hate. It ain't going to happen. So all I was doing was, in a sense, I'm making pun and a play on words and comfort and so on. But the gist of what you're talking about is there may even be, for example, a space for some beings to confront fearful situations, and the basic learning is just to realize that they don't get wiped out by it, and so that's kind of good in a way. But that's a really paltry, small learning in a very risky business to make a really small learning, right? And so in the Mahamudra tradition, in Buddhism, well, particularly in the Tibetan tradition, or Mahayana tradition, we often approach it more sideways, obliquely. And so there's quite a lot of work goes into strengthening your being. Because we say, well, actually to go into these really difficult, challenging situations, you need all your strength to be able to learn from them. Otherwise you just freak out with them. Otherwise you just react to them. You don't really learn anything, or very little. And so to be able to really learn and appreciate and come to a transformative understanding in this situation that before was just kind of froze you right up, there needs to be already a certain degree of strength and skill and so on. And so in the Mahamudra tradition, once the person has, in a sense, supported the good, well-functioning talents of their being so that they've got a kind of a basis that they can actively dip into and nourish themselves with, then you'd enter into what was sometimes called dredging work. And you would literally dredge up, the memory of terrifying experiences. This is the charnel ground meditations and and all the wrathful deities in the Tibetan tradition. It's just like you're bringing this kind of stuff up. And then it's not from the point of view. In the West, we look at it at a kind of therapy level. It's almost like, well, I can kind of face this and I'm okay and I'm strong. This is just one ego against another ego. But if we were to look at it and be able to look into, how does this, what I've been saying today, this complete, total organismic functioning, right, arise such that fear is present, right? To do that, you've got to be interested. When you're interested, there is no fear. So it wipes out the fear, not because you've become immune to it or because you've wiped it out with the fundamental manner of wiping out difficulty, interest. Mr. Hearn, I'm sorry to tell you, but you've got cancer, right? Or, oh, that's interesting. Or, right? How's it going to be? And I'm saying that not to kind of try and dance up and down in some heroic state, right? But it was just like a very potent and revealing situation, because I have an interest, I tend to make the effort to get the results of scans and tests and everything as soon as I can. So I often get them before I have the visit, the consultation, to talk to the person who's going to tell me this was your result. I already know the result. And so I knew the result of the biopsy. And I knew that we had to do something. I knew we needed to do a prostatectomy. I'd already decided when I went there that was the best way forward. And I was happy with that, in a sense. And Mary and I went into the hospital, and they said, oh, will you come and sit in this room? And we're sitting there, and there's lots of busyness out in the hall. And then suddenly I heard what I thought was Tarchin. Now, there's not too many Tarchins around. You know what I mean? That's the advantage of having a weird name like that. And so, my ear perked up and I thought, oh, they're talking about me. And I realized it was nurses and doctors and so on in the room across the hall. At that point, one of them got up and came to the door and closed our door and then closed their door. And they continued. And I said to Mary, they're trying to discuss how to break the news. And then they came in, and I said, well, I guess we've got work to do. And the doctor just relaxed. Oh, you know. Oh, good, okay. And then he told me afterwards, he said, this is quite rare. He said, usually in this consultation, that's all we can do is tell the person this is the situation. Then we make another appointment a little bit later to decide what to do. Whereas we actually set the schedule, looked at the time, when are we going to do the operation? It was just done, right? And I mean, there was nothing special about it for me. It's just me being my character. You know, going, okay, this is interesting. And so it didn't wipe out my fear. I didn't have terrifying fear and then it was wiped out. There was no fear there. There was interest. There was a degree of interest, right? There are floods of anxiety that come and go and so on, yes, but in the course of this journey, I've realized that there are a tragic number of people in our culture who have things like cancer or conditions like cancer who are flattened by it emotionally. I mean, it's bad enough you got cancer, but then they get sick. You know, they're sick with the fear of having cancer. You know, so at least most of the time I just had to have cancer. I didn't have to be sick with my cancer. and so, you know, in a way it's like the interest changes. You can't actually be interested in something and terrified and fearful and frozen at the same time. It's just the functioning doesn't allow that. It doesn't happen. Right? So the very act of when the Buddha said, you know, first of all, there's suffering, you know, so you acknowledge that. So if I'm always running away and pretending it's all hunky-dory, no, for this being, face your suffering, right? Face your fear, face your, right? And then gradually as you're facing it, right, you begin to appreciate the causes of suffering. And, you know, initially you say, oh, it's because this bug came in and infected me, or because this person doesn't like me. Later on, you begin to say, yes, that's true, but that's an observer's description. The generative mechanism of the suffering is the way the whole of my beingness is functioning, because if it functions with interest, there's no suffering, right? And with the understanding of the cause of suffering, along with the understanding of the cause of suffering which comes with interest, is the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering. It's just automatic. The cessation of suffering is in the seeing of is the interest in the cause of suffering. The cause of all your suffering is the magnificent totality of the universe, the evolving universe. That's the cause of your suffering. Right? The cause of your suffering is God. The cause of your suffering is Buddha, right? The cause of your, you know, it's kind of meaningless to say that, but it's like, And then having experienced the cessation of suffering, it's possible that you might have the moment to go, how did that come into being? And you begin to appreciate the path to the cessation of suffering, which is the path of the cessation of suffering. The path to the cessation of suffering is the path of the cessation of suffering. The cessation of suffering is the path to the cessation of suffering. Suffering is not the path to the cessation of suffering. And so the description of the Four Noble Truths is more like, or the Eightfold Noble Path is more like a kind of general description of a way of living for a human being that supports an environment in which this inquisitiveness and curiosity of your own mind, which is precise and playful at the same time, right, can engage with interest in the process of living and wonderment, sharing on the way, right, and we together unfold, right? And so, I mean, that's all the Buddha taught, the Four Noble Truths right there. So, in a sense, fronting up to your fear and so on is right there in the First Noble Truth, borderline Second Noble Truth. But merely, you've kind of just got a fear of novelty or something. So if you just keep throwing yourself out of the airplane with a parachute, again and again and again, with the idea that eventually you'll become cool with it, right? Without it ever dawning on you that there's actually being interested in the awesome dance of beingness that we are, you're not going to come to the cessation of suffering through confrontation. Yeah. I'd like to stop for this morning. We've had about 8 or 9 days of teaching in a row. I'm wondering if there would be an appreciation of a day of no teaching, or whether or not the flow of this is it's not that we don't have enough material to cover, right? The sadhana's only on the point of getting juicy. So we can. I'm trying to monitor your space, right? Of how you'd like to work. Right? We can just continue on having class each morning, but I'm also aware occasionally we would have deepening day and a no class day. But if
you have one more before the break. That's
fine. That's what I'm asking for. I'm asking for a response.
Deepening day, please, tomorrow.
Yeah.
I wanted to know if it would be helpful for you to not have to talk for an hour and a half tomorrow for your own cold or whatever's happening.
It might be. Oh, I'm willing to find out either way. Right.
I'd be happy with it. Either.
Okay.
There's sometime this week.
Deepening day sometime this week. Right.
Should we have a show of hands?
Going, come on, anyone. Going. One more day. Going, gone to the best, highest bidder. Day after tomorrow. So we'll have a class tomorrow. That's all right. We sort of go into the essential practice, right? And then the next day we'll have a deepening day, right? We'll have just one day of no class, and with the idea is that it's not the day off. It's a day just to, especially get up in the morning and just let your natural rhythms go rather than having to rush here. If it felt like a rush here, sometimes our rhythms are different in you're happy to come. And then another day, you're kind of, oh well, I guess, okay, it's time to go. But you could just as easily stay in the flow of your contemplation. So we'll have a deepening day on Tuesdays, it's called. Sorry, June. You'll have to hang in there.
That's all good.
Yeah. May the day be well, and the night be well, and the midday hours bring happiness too. May both day and night always be well. By the blessing of the Triple Gem, may all be auspicious. Sarvamangalam.